Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the Ohio Workforce Coalition's webinar. Before we officially jump in, I want to just share a couple housekeeping items for those of you who are regulars with us. This will not be anything new. We do ask that you enter questions into the chat so that we can combine them and share them throughout the presentation or towards the end. And then you are welcome to keep your phones on mute, but also unmute if you'd like to speak your question. And you don't need to use your video today unless you'd like us to see your smiling face. So about the coalition, since 2007, the Ohio Workforce Coalition has been bringing together workforce development leaders and stakeholders from across various ecosystems, really to share information, build different networks, and advocate for public policies that build the skills of adult workers, support employers, and strengthen the overall workforce system. Our most recent policy priorities can be found online at ohioworkforcecoalition.org, along with recordings of previous webinars, resources for national experts, and a button for donating. So now let's turn it over to today's topic. So in the early days of the coalition, there was a core group of leadership committee members that helped frame the goals of the coalition and really gave it the energy it needed to get off the ground. And Qiana was one of them. She served on the leadership committee and offered the business perspective as a member of the HR team at Limited Brands. And she's currently the Vice President of Culture, Engagement, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at OhioHealth. And that is a mouthful of a title. But during her career, she's really built expertise in partnering with senior leaders to drive strategy and culture transformation, and really brings to OhioHealth the diversity work that she also did at L Brands and Huntington National Bank. You have her bio in the invitation. I could not be more thrilled that she's here to talk to us today. It's always great to have someone from the business community who really has a good understanding of the workforce world to talk to us about racial equity in the workplace. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Qiana and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for having me. It is, kind of to Rebecca's point, it's, pretty cool to be so many years removed from the Workforce Coalition and to see it still thriving and doing amazing work. That's really exciting. But I'm even more excited to be here with you all having this conversation. And I hope it will be a conversation. I spend a lot of my time as a talking head, kind of flipping through slides, and I'm really hopeful that that won't be what today is, that today will really be an opportunity for me to share, some of the best practices of our work and things that, we have, done that I feel like have really moved the needle, where we still have opportunities as well. And, how folks like yourself and the organizations that you represent can, be supportive in the journey. Couple things. So, I want to make sure that, I'm meeting the needs of the group. And so, some of the things that Rebecca and I had talked about is, really talking about racial equity strategies, obviously in the workforce, what's meaningful, what's woke washing, that type of thing. How do you foster conversations about racial equity in the workplace? Racial equity approaches from different perspectives, so rural and urban, conservative and liberal, like that type of thing. And then obviously, how can community-based organizations engage? And so, all of those feel like really meaty and meaningful topics to me. But again, like Rebecca said, if there are other things that, come to mind for you, please put those in the chat and I'll do my best to respond to those as well. So even though you're mostly not on camera, I do like to try to make these engaging as possible. And so one of the things that, I like to do is to have everyone respond to an initial question for me. And I think that this question kind of sets the tone for why this work is so important. And then there'll be some other questions that I'll kind of pose to the group throughout our discussion today. But that first question is, if you could just kind of pop into the chat and share, what age were you when you had your first Black teacher? So what age were you when you had your first Black teacher? So I'll wait till some of the comments start to come in. Yeah. Some college, 6th grade. Yeah. So a lot of, kind of what I expect. So, so as Rebecca said, I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion. Well, I should say I just transitioned from the role of Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at OhioHealth. I'm now the Vice President of Total Rewards and HR Operations. But as I was doing our diversity work, one of the things that was important for us to start and to have meaningful work around this was to start with conversations, right? And this is a question that I often pose in settings, with our leaders and our associates, because it really starts to help people frame just how challenging this discussion around race is. And so when you start to think for yourself, that some people, right, like think about the importance of teachers, right? Like think about how teachers have shaped, who we are. Oftentimes when we go back in our minds and we think about some of our most formative experiences outside of our relationship with our parents, it's teachers, right? We spent a lot of time with those. And so you can begin to imagine to yourself what that means when, people may not have had any exposure to that type of person until, later in life. What that does from the shaping, right, of, who you are with respect to seeing people in leadership positions, seeing people in kind of those nurturing roles that, shape who we are, so on and so forth. And so, when I first did that question with our senior executive team, I had a couple of people who, everybody was hesitant to post. And so you can imagine, some people were hesitant to post, the age, because they felt like that was reflective of, who they were, right? And none of us choose our teachers, right? At the end of the day, we go to the school that our parents enroll us in, but it underscores how tenuous these conversations around race are, right? At the end of the day, it's just a fact. I didn't have my first Black teacher until I was 16, or I didn't have my first Black teacher until I was in college, right? Like that's just a fact. There's nothing that we can do about it, but there's something that comes up for people when they have to answer that question that really underscores why these conversations are difficult but more importantly, why we need to have them. So when I think about our journey here at OhioHealth, it really started with looking at our data. And so for us, what we did is we looked across all of our workforce. Because we're a healthcare organization, it was really important for us to also look at our patient population. And immediately what we saw was that there was a disconnect between who we were serving and what our workforce looked like. And not our workforce writ large, but our leadership workforce. So what we saw right off the bat was that our patient population was upwards of 18% people of color. And our leadership population was less than 5% people of color. And that was eye-opening to our leaders with respect to, oh my goodness, how are we truly serving our community if the people making decisions for our community aren't reflective of the community. And so we began to slice and dice the data more because, as you all know, diversity is bigger than race, is bigger than gender, right? And so we really wanted to start where it made the most sense. So we looked at, our LGBTQ population. We looked at, the data from a gender lens. We looked at the data from an age lens. Like, we looked at it every way possible. And what we saw was that we needed to start with race. It was where our biggest gap was, and it was, clearly where, we had the biggest opportunity to do something transformative. And as you can imagine, if you go back to that first question that I asked, there was definitely some hand wringing. One of the things that I've experienced doing this work, like Rebecca said, I've done it at 3 different organizations. There's something about having a conversation with people and telling them that you want to lean into race that puts them in a position that they don't get into when you'd say, I want to lean into gender, or I want to lean into sexual orientation, or I want to lean into tenure. Like, I had people who said to me, I know that our data says that we should start with race, but let's start with diversity of thought. Let's start with this. And one of the things that I had to get really comfortable with was being the challenger. And so, what I said to folks is, of course, we could start in all of those places, but in starting in all of those places means that where we could end up is with a room full of white people, right? Because if you start with, all of these things that people want to start with, we're still not going to be reflective of our community if we don't make the decision to start with race. And so, those are hard conversations for some people to have. But, one of the things that was super helpful for me was the fact that I had a CEO who is uber engaged in this. And part of it was because he had his own kind of, personal experiences. He was, going to forums where there were other CEOs, and, he was hearing from African-American and Latinx CEOs about their experience. One in particular had shared with him about how he was driving in his neighborhood and he got pulled over, right? So the whole idea of driving while Black. And so, this was somebody who, had reached what you would believe is the pinnacle of their career, right? They're the CEO of a major organization, driving through a neighborhood where they have a home, right? And still, like, there's not a safety in it. And that was a real, kind of light bulb moment for our CEO. I think the other thing was he was at the end of his career. And so he was contemplating retirement. And he was thinking about, what legacy am I leaving behind in the organization? And so, that was really important to have him as my partner in advancing this work. So, so what I would say is, all organizations, it's so important to start with the data. When you start with the data, it's hard for people to refute where you're talking about going. And so that's the first thing that we did. So we started with our data. The second thing that we did is that we really looked at who are we as an organization, and what stories do people believe about who we are? And that starts with our values. And so our values had been the values of the organization for 24 years. We had never looked at them, never decided to change them. And so one of the things that we discussed at that point in time was, how do we do something transformative, and how do we really put a stake in the ground around who we are? And so we made the decision at that point in time that we were going to add a new value of inclusion. And so the process for doing that was, let's get out and let's talk to as many associates as possible. Let's bring them on this journey with us. Let's have them help us define who we are from an inclusion standpoint. And, this was really some of the most meaningful work that, I feel like I've ever been engaged in, because part of it is people can align to the idea of inclusion, right? Who doesn't want to be included, right? Who wants to intentionally exclude people? But when you start to talk about, okay, so when we're talking about inclusion and we're a faith-based organization, that means, we may be including people who historically, based on your faith, you may not agree, with how they live their life. Or you may have been raised, to, an earlier point, you may have been raised in a rural environment and, never had to interact with certain people or were raised to believe a certain thing. And so it's not just inclusion, right? Like it's diversity and inclusion together. And so when we were bicycling around the organization, there was just a ton of work and a ton of conversation to say, what does this really mean for us as an organization? And and the reason why I bring this up is because the linchpin to making this successful, was accountability. So people said to us, well, yeah, you can change the value, you can add a value of inclusion, right? You can tell us that, this is what it means to be inclusive, but what if I'm not? What if the person next to me is not? What are you going to do then? Right? And that was really the light bulb moment, right? Like it's not enough to change the value, right? You have to have accountability with that. And so then once again, right, there's this come to Jesus conversation that I'm having with our senior executives around, okay, once we're this visible around this work, a lot of stuff is going to start bubbling up, right? And so we have to lock arms and say, we're committed to this journey. And if you're not committed to the journey, this may not be the place for you. Doesn't mean that we don't, give people some grace and help people, move along the path. But there are times where, it's not education. So I'll give you an example. So, we had we had a portion of our organization that was having a Halloween party. And somebody decided that they wanted to come as Serena Williams. They love Serena, and she's their favorite tennis player. So a couple of things that are important about the story. So the person who loves Serena was not African American. And so to truly pay homage to Serena, she felt like she needed to really assume Serena. And so she came to work in blackface. And not just blackface. I think that, most of us pray to have the shape of Serena. And so this person actually decided that, they wanted to, put some padding in to, have the shape of Serena and everything, right? And in their mind, this was, like I said, an homage to Serena. They love her. And so the beauty of this horrific moment was that even though this person was in a leadership position, it was somebody in a position that was lower than them who said, like, this is inappropriate. Like, I can't believe that. Now, mind you, there were other people who were walking around offended, but didn't, raise the alarm. But this person did and said, I can't believe, like, this can't possibly be who we are. And so, there was no equivocation, right, around what we needed to do, in this particular situation. And so, so that's kind of that second part that I'm talking about, right? So you have your data, you've changed your values, but if there is no teeth, if there is no accountability, right? Because sometimes people think accountability is, oh, well, and this has been something that somebody said to me, maybe we can have them read White Fragility, right? White Fragility is an important book, right? I've had my entire senior team read the book. White fragility is not accountability, right? Like telling somebody to read a book is not accountability, right? And so you really have to, get really clear about, when you lean in one way and when you lean in another way. And so, the other thing that I think has helped us along that is that we are constantly listening and talking to our associates. And we're doing that in a number of forums. And we're kind of filtering that data as well. So, we have focus groups, we have our engagement survey, but we are bifurcating that data by, racial groups, right? And then within racial groups, we're bifurcating it by gender, right? Because I think that we all know that, while, Black folks on a whole, Latinx folks on a whole, so on and so forth are, experience marginalization in organizations, intersectionality also plays a piece. And so looking at the experience.
I found this on the web first.
Sorry, Siri started talking. Looking at, how what Black women's experiences in organizations are, what Asian women's experience in our organization is, like that mattered to us, right? Because you want to put the right thing in place. And then in addition to that, right, also, appreciating that even, white folks' experience in our organization may require us to actually put some things in place as well, right? So it's not just people of color who may be being marginalized. There could be places in our organization where white folks are being marginalized, right? Based on the positions that they hold, right? So if you think about, we're a healthcare organization, which means that we're largely female. The nursing population is, the largest part of our workforce. When you start to drill down, that's a largely female led position, well, not led, largely female workforce, excuse me. And then when you drill down in there, right, you start to look at, are there pay discrepancies, right? And those would impact, people across the board. So that's what I mean about, constantly allowing the data to lead us, but also being really intentional about not just looking at surface data, drilling down into that data so that we really understand the intersections of that data as well. So we did that, right? And then that's when we started having those meaningful conversations. That's when we said, it's not just enough to kind of change our values, hold unconscious bias sessions. Now we actually need to have these really meaningful conversations where we're pressing on topics. And so, one of the discussion sessions that we had, and I'm going to put this out there to the group. So, we asked, a really challenging question for folks. And I'm going to ask you all to reflect on this question as well in the chat. But one of the things that we had to do is what I'm going to do with you guys and say, when I ask this question, some things may come up for you where you may try to change the question, or you may feel challenged to answer the question, but I just want you to kind of sit in what that feeling is. And then when you can get to a place to answer the question that I'm specifically asking, would love for you to do that in the chat. So the question is, so it's a two-part question. So the first part of the question is, when have Black lives mattered to you? And when have Black lives not mattered to you? So we can just take a moment. So it looks like I see some people typing. Other people aren't on camera, so I don't know if you're typing, but hopefully, hopefully you're thinking about your response. And as you're doing that, because I want this to be like I said, an opportunity for you folks to be able to engage, but also this is about, kind of teachable moments. And so, So this was really hard for our organization, and not everybody. There were some people who were really able to lean into the question, but there were other people, as you can imagine, who, wanted to tell me when all lives have mattered to them and when all lives haven't mattered to them, right? And so that's why, I give the caveat of, experience what's coming up for you around why it's hard to answer the specific question. And, and some of, what we heard are, things similar to, what we hear, right now about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And, and the goal in asking the question in our organization, again, was, we're starting with race. Generally, the hardest part of conversations around race are around, Black and Latinx communities, which, doesn't mean that, Asian communities, I mean, we've seen a lot, over the last year with Asian communities, right? It doesn't mean that, Asian communities aren't, challenged by race, right? But, it's generally a quieter challenge. But, just like Chelsea said, yeah, people were uncomfortable, they were embarrassed, all of those types of things. But so my coaching to the organization is that's where we have to push, right? Like when you are seeing those emotions coming up for you, right? Like that's when we have to push, and like that's when we have to, kind of get over that hump to really get to the other side of it. And so, one of the things that I think was super helpful was that, we had people of color in the room who had to answer this question too, right? Because there are times, right? So if I think about, that question, when do Black lives matter to me, right? I believe they matter to me every single day, right? I have two beautiful children who, I think about, their experience in this world every single day. And, in doing this work, I'm trying to like dismantle various things so that, they don't have that experience. But when have they not mattered to me? And, what I share with the group is that sometimes doing this work is so heavy, so hard. Somebody says something crazy and I'm like, not again. Like this time it can't be me, right? Like this time I'm just going to be quiet. I'm going to let somebody else, say the thing, right? And so in that moment, right, it feels like Black lives don't matter to me because I'm tired of being the one who has to say X, Y, and Z. But you can't get tired, right? That's the thing that, I always tell myself is because, there are people, in other places in my organization who are counting on the fact that I'm in this position and I'm saying the thing, I'm doing the thing. And so me sharing that, as part of these sessions, so so obviously, like I'm generally in every session. So when I started to share those things, to Chelsea's earlier point, right, it kind of gave people permission to share the things that made them embarrassed or made them feel challenged. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I think that we all know that we all come to every conversation with our own biases. And, nobody is exempt from that. And so I think, when people started to say, okay, Qiana's struggling with this, sometimes as well, let me be willing to be vulnerable and figure out how I get on the other side of that. So thank you for, kind of the folks who, posted things in the chat. It's something that I think is, really important to just constantly be assessing, so every single day I think to myself, that very question, and, ask myself, are there times where, I'm retreating when I should be leaning in? So I do want to share a video. It might be something that you all have seen before, but it's something that I shared with our organization because I really think that it addresses systemic racism in just the way that is really easy for people to engage with. So let's hope this will work. Says I am sharing full screen.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American. and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So, so I love that video because I feel like in a very, kind of innocuous way, it tells a story that, many of us have been, trying to tell. And the reason why it was so important for me to share that in our organization is because I think that a lot of times in our organizations, we believe in a meritocracy, right? We believe that everybody, who's in their position got there because, they worked hard, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, yada, yada, yada. And if people aren't there, it's because they didn't work as hard, or, they're not as smart, on and on and on. And, one of the things that we had to do is kind of dispel that myth. because, part of, the challenge that, we were experiencing was not only the belief that the meritocracy was ruling, but also a belief that we wanted to upend meritocracy, right? Like, one of the things that, I often would hear from people is, well, yeah, I believe in diversity, but I want the most qualified person, right? And so, just this notion that somehow those two things like couldn't coexist. And so, so we really had to unpack, the belief that those two things can't coexist, but also help people understand that, as much as we want to believe a meritocracy is at play, it just isn't. And so a couple things happen as a result of, watching this video for our leadership. So one of the things is, we started to assess, whether or not we could do name blinded resumes, right? So how do we, move in that direction of figuring out how we remove bias from the interviewing process? The second thing that we did and that we continue to do to this day is, we had our own version of the Rooney Rule. And so, anyone who, follows, the NFL, and I'll say this, like, we do a better job of the Rooney Rule than the NFL does. So, but anybody who follows the NFL knows the Rooney Rule is a mandate that the NFL put in place that every time there was a head coaching opening, that they had to have a diverse slate of candidates, a racially and ethnically diverse slate of candidates. And, what has happened in the NFL is it's really a wink and a nod to that, right? Whereas, in our organization, we've really been holding people's feet to the fire. And so what we implemented is that for every leadership opening, that there has to be a minimum of 2 racially or ethnically diverse candidates on the slate for an offer to be extended. And if they do not have that criteria met, then they actually have to put forward a business case to ask for an exception. And we present out the groups who have asked for exceptions every quarter. So, there's, kind of, a scarlet letter put on folks who are constantly asking for exceptions. And so, so we have this exception review committee. I sit on it. We have 3 of our other senior leaders who sit on that exception. And we review every exception. And it's not a rubber stamp. We have, on several occasions sent people back and said, no, we won't grant you an exception. You really have to demonstrate that you have, done the due diligence of looking at, the market and sought out non-traditional sources and or have like a business case where, the sky is going to fall before we'll actually, grant those exceptions. And so, one of the things is, it's one of those things where you have to build the muscle. So for us in the beginning, the waves of exceptions that were coming through were overwhelming. But now, we really have created an environment where, people, feel anxiety around asking for an exception. And so, one of the things and where we've seen that benefit is, so if you go back to, kind of some of my earlier remarks around, we were at less than 5% leadership representation when I started in this role, which was almost 3 years ago. And we're now at almost 12%. So, if you think about, thanks, Leroy. I see the clapping, appreciate that, but but that is work that requires intention, requires accountability, requires that, you put the tools in place for people to, be able to be successful. And one of the things that was super important for me is that people didn't expect that the diversity and inclusion team was going to find all the candidates, right? one of the things that, I made it really clear about is, we're all recruiters, right? So when you're, out with your friends, you should be thinking to yourself, do my friends know anybody who would be great for this opportunity? We pride ourselves on great customer service. If you have a customer service opportunity and you're out at the grocery store and you see somebody who's, exhibiting great customer service, are you saying to them, OhioHealth is better than, I'm just going to, pick on, than Kroger? Like, you should come to work at OhioHealth, right? Like, we need to constantly be thinking about how are we a magnet for talent. And I'll tell you, one time I was at BW3 and I didn't realize that I had my badge on. And there was a young lady who was taking my order and she was like, oh my gosh, you work at OhioHealth. I've been trying to get in there, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, here's my contact information. And she followed up with me the next day and she's a medical assistant here with us today. Right. And so that was the thing that I was trying to get everybody to think about, right? Like, everywhere you go, you should be looking for great talent. So, so those are some of the things that, we did, that idea of looking at the data, being accountable, having intentional conversations, training. And I did mean to say earlier when I was talking about the training, one of the things that I saw in the beginning was that people were really biased towards unconscious bias. Every time I turn around, somebody would say, well, they just need unconscious bias training. They need, and what that, and a lot of people do, don't get me wrong, but what that does is it pays short shrift to the fact that some of the things that we're experiencing are very conscious bias, right? Unconscious bias is not the only thing that is, like, prevalent. And so that was one of the other things that was really important for us, is to get people comfortable with having the hard conversations, get people comfortable with talking about racism versus just bias, getting people comfortable with talking about xenophobia versus just unconscious bias, right? Like, naming what we're talking about. And along with that naming is, there were times where we were specifically talking about, we need to do something related to Black folks, right? And people would, think that the word people of color was interchangeable. And so again, it's about, let's say what we're talking about, because you can't really fix a problem if you're unwilling to name it. And so, that was one of the things that I would say was super important. So I'm going to fast forward us a little bit. So, we move into last summer, right? The murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. One of the things that I was proud about our organization was that our journey has started with race. So we were ready in that moment to engage the topics in ways that some of my peers had to pivot to, because they hadn't, leaned into race yet. And so, one of the things that we did that, I think was, just real, I don't want to call it groundbreaking, because it wasn't groundbreaking, but it was something that I felt like really pushed the envelope. And that was, we had 7 sessions that were singularly focused on what could white people do in this moment, right? Because one of the things that was happening was our Black associates were coming to me and saying, my coworker just stopped me in the hallway and asked me to explain 4 years of racism. And, I can barely get through the day, right? Like, I cannot be educating people right now. Like, I honestly don't even want to be here right now, right? And so we were getting that, like people were just coming, like, like left and right, like, please help. So we called a timeout. We actually sent a communication to all our leaders and said, stop asking Black people to explain racism. That's why you have a diversity and inclusion team. And what we're going to do is we're going to host these sessions. So we called them Undoing Racism. And there's a local trainer who did them with me. Her name is Suzanne Roberts. So she's a white woman who has been doing a lot of anti-racism training or whatever. And so she and I did these education sessions where, you know, we went back to slavery, right? And really unpacked, you know, kind of slavery to now. And, you know, like to a person. So, you know, we have 30,000 associates. We probably had 50% of our people who, you know, went through these sessions, but to a person, you know, people were, I mean, like there was crying and, you know, that kind of thing, but, you know, that's not the part that I want to underscore. But to a person, people said that they were fundamentally changed by having this session, right? And, you know, there were people who said, you know, there were things that I learned in the session that, you know, I can't believe that, you know, I didn't learn in school, which, you know, we all know, you know, is an ongoing theme. But then there were people who said, you know, I learned this in school, but I haven't even re-engaged it. And I'm thinking of myself as a healthcare provider and how all of these things impact the patients that I see every day. And I had completely lost sight of that. And so, you know, so for me, the learning was, how do we constantly tie this work to what we're doing every single day, right? Our North Star is the health and well-being of our patients and our community. So how do we constantly tie racial equity, DE&I to the work that we're doing every single day? And so that's what we've done since then. So, you know, we've developed a disparity dashboard so that our providers can see every single day, you know, what it looks like to be a patient in our organization. And they can cut it by gender, and they can cut it by payer class, and they can cut it by socioeconomic status, and they can cut it by race, right? So that they're seeing every single day what their work, or, you know, what the health outcomes are, what the disparities are for people across the board. So I want to pause again just to make sure that there aren't any questions that I'm missing in the chat.
I got a couple questions that came directly to me, Qiana. So okay, if it's okay, I can share those questions. So one is specifically about the workforce development field, since you're familiar with it and you're talking about the level of comfort with how you talk about race. And the field is grappling with how folks like job developers and employer-facing staff engage with the business community about race as they're trying to decide where to place people, where not to, and to generally tackle equity in an employment situation. And so there was a request for suggestions for workforce development staff on how to engage in conversation with prospective employers.
Yes, I think that's a great question. And, you know, one of the things that I think is, you know, kind of playing in your favor is you would be hard pressed to find an organization that is not leaning into DE&I some way here. And the other thing you'd be you will find is that, you know, many organizations are still unsure of what to do. And so, you know, what I would encourage workforce development practitioners is to, you know, you take the lead on that conversation, right? You talk to the employer and say, you know, can you tell me about what your diversity, equity, inclusion strategy is? How can we help you advance your work around DE&I? And part of that, you know, goes back to kind of the thing that I had said earlier around know the data. So look at the industry that, you know, like you're working in, or the industries that you're working in, and be really clear on the data so that you can, you know, come to an employer like me and say, you know, so for instance, right now, you know, we're having a difficult time, you know, with nurses, right? And so, you know, if you were working with me, you'd want to come to me and say, you know, this is what, you know, the industry looks like, you know, this is where you might be missing, you know, a great talent pool, and, you know, here's how it can help your DE&I strategy. right? So I think if you're proactive like that and, seek to fill a need, as you already do, then, people will really glom onto that, because I know that folks are struggling. So much so that, I'm sure everyone is familiar with what the Columbus Partnership. So the Columbus Partnership is leaning into, the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so, and that's all, kind of the CEOs of, the leading companies. And so that to me says there's a real opportunity for people who can fill that gap.
Thank you. So there's another question from Lenroy that is consistent with the question I got directly again. As you shared this story about the Qiana Williams costume, obviously there were a lot of folks recognizing the inappropriateness of that now. But so Lenroy is interested in hearing about what companies are doing to address that sort of behavior. And the question I got was, what did you do to make that employee comfortable? Whoever spoke up, you said it was a staff to a leadership. What did you do to make it a safe space for that staff to speak up?
Yeah. So the first part of the question, I thought I remember the first part of the question. The first part of the question was, what are other companies doing? So one of the things that we did is we actually created a rubric, right? Because everything isn't, let's fire you, right? And everything isn't go to training, right? And so we created a rubric that says, that takes into a number of different factors that determine, what exactly we should be doing. And part of that is, does the person recognize what they did was wrong? Is the person willing to, apologize for the behavior and, make amends for, what they've done? And, if people aren't willing to acknowledge the wrongness of what they've done, if they're not willing to right the wrong, then, then there's probably something bigger, right? Like they're probably not aligned to our culture. They're probably not aligned to our values. But if somebody is willing to do that, there could be an opportunity for, truth and reconciliation. And so then the second part of the question was, what do we do? So what the associate said was, it was them holding us accountable to changing our values. So what he said is, at the point in time where we changed, because this was after we had changed our values, he said he believed what we said. And so he said, this is going to be an opportunity for the organization to prove whether or not changing the value to inclusion actually holds any weight. So that's what he said, gave him the comfort to speak up when others weren't.
Thank you. Are there other questions from participants? I could certainly throw in plenty of my own questions, but we've just a few minutes left if anyone wants to pop on and ask a question. If not, I'll just keep going. All right, well, I will squeeze one more in then. And this is directly from me. I can only imagine what it would have felt for you as a Black woman to have to embrace the role of playing the challenger, and to be that person, constantly raising issues. You mentioned the CEO of your organization being a real partner. Were there any other unexpected champions or allies that you encountered along the way that made that any easier?
Yeah, it's a great question. And then Lenroy, I see that you have your hand up as well. So I'll make sure I hang on to answer that last question too. So yes, so, and I think, so a number of our senior executives were supportive, willing to be challengers. So definitely felt like I had their partnership there. Our board was very engaged. So we had some key board members who also were pushing the conversation as well. And then, we have some very active business resource groups and diversity and inclusion councils. And, I felt like we were also kind of having that groundswell as well, where people were, kind of pushing leaders to engage in a particular way. So I think it was coming from a number of different directions, Rebecca, that I think were also helpful. And then, the last thing I'll say is, and then also, just what was happening in the community, right? So, if I think about when I was doing this work, however many years ago, not to age myself, at L Brands, right? The tone and tenor of the larger society was very different from the tone and tenor now. And, you just have more people, be those millennials or, whoever who, demand something different. Yeah.
Thank you. Lenroy, you had a question?
Yes, just an observation. I know I'm doing a pivot into the DEI space, and I've just noticed the circles that I've been in, there are very few men or in roles, or even when I go back and look at the people that have been hired, if you're straight and an African-American male, there's a less likelihood that you're being really seriously considered for that position. Even though the types of experience that I've had some companies that have really taken me extremely seriously, but I'm like, it's just an eerie space to be in, that we need to have those individuals in there, and I just don't see them. It's just like today I kept looking through.
Yeah.
And I've been very engaged and really focused on the intentionality of trying to bring about this solution to the changes that we really need.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. And, and this is, why I think intersectionality is so important, because I do think that a lot of times, men of color in particular get lumped into the experiences of men in general, right? And, people think that, because a lot of times when we talk about the wage gap, right, like we say, this is what, like women experience, this is what men experience. But when you actually break that down and you look at the experiences of men of color, right, the men of color's experiences aren't, similar to white men's experience. And so, it's really important for us to, push that. And that was actually a conversation that, I had internally. There's this really good report that I'll send to Rebecca and she can share with the group that really talks about the experiences of men of color. So that's one thing that I'll say. The other thing, if you're talking specifically, in the diversity and inclusion space, there are some, great, men of color, African-American men in particular, who are doing the work locally. So again, happy to share that information as well, to help you build your network with some of them.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are right at 2:00. This conversation probably could go on for a few more hours, but I imagine, Qiana, you have lots of important work to do, so we will let you go. Again, the recording will be available. I do ask that you share it when you get the recording sent out. I think this is an important topic, and it's incumbent upon all of us to keep it top of mind and really push the envelope and join Qiana as a challenger. So thank you, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.